This is going to be a tutorial creating a game-ready asset 3D barrel. This is aimed at beginner level, so we're going to be looking at the edible poly, how to manipulate vertices and edges. We're going to be looking at UVs and eventually photo manipulation for texture. And then we'll put that asset into Marmoset ready for presentation. Like I said, this tutorial is aimed very much at the beginner level. We're not going to be doing anything crazily advanced, and because of that, the poly counts would be higher than you would generally have in a game engine, but we're not going to be delving too deeply into things like normal maps, etc. With that said though, we would be expecting a certain level of understanding of the software. So we're going to be using 3ds Max for polygon modeling and UV mapping, and Photoshop for texturing. I'd expect you to be able to understand how to navigate those pieces of software and have a basic understanding of some of the tools. Anything that I do use, I will try and outline as much as possible. And in the bottom left hand corner of the screen, as I'm working in the software, there will be a key cap so you can see what keys I'm pressing. With that said, let's get going.
So, first things that we need to think about is, for step one, is research. Now, research is probably one of the most important things when it comes to designing and creating a 3D model. You've got to think of a couple of things. You've got to think about how that object is built in the first place. You've got to think about what materials it's made from. And for this wooden barrel, there's a few other little ones. So things like, what are the dimensions of it? How is it? What is the physicality of it? So how it is built. So we need to actually have a look at some barrels. So let's just pull some images up here of wooden barrels, and we can see that it clearly has this very distinct curve to it. It's not like a metal barrel that is straight up. A wooden barrel has a curve to it, and it also has these individual wooden planks. So it's not one solid mass, it's not manufactured from one solid piece. It's individual planks that are then being held in place by these metal bands that wrap around the top and the bottom. So let's just pull in another one and have a look at a different one. So we can see here we've clearly got those top and bottom bands like we did in the last one, but there's also an extra 3 here. So depending on the wooden barrel, it depends on how it's manufactured. We also have these little bits that sort of wrap round. So the metal bands. So instead of just a solid band, it's actually a metal strip that's wrapped round the barrel and then overlapped on top of each other and then held in place by these 2 little rivets. So when we're thinking about how something has been manufactured, we have to look at it closely and try and work it out. So let's just bring in a third image. So we can see here it's clearly got those individual planks, but we can see from the top that the top piece is also made from planks going in the opposite direction. So we've got the vertical and the horizontal to think about. So that's our how is it built. The materials, quite simple on this object. We can see clearly from the 3 images a particular type of wood that makes up the main portion of it. So what type of wood is it? What are the material definition? And that completely depends on the barrel itself, what type of barrel it is. Things like what is the reflectivity, what is the specularity. It depends on the wear and tear of the object, how much it's gone through since it was originally manufactured, since it was brand new. Our second material is this metal that we have right here on the bands, and we can see from it, if we look very closely, it's tarnished and it's got a very low reflectivity value. So that's our material. So next up is we want to, before we even start thinking about 3D modeling it, let's just do a quick Google search and see if we can find what are the dimensions of a wooden barrel. And Google's very helpfully come up here straight away with an answer. So we've got around 23 inch in diameter. It's 35 inches tall and 23 to 20 inch in diameter. So those are the two key points that we need to remember. So let's just clear all of these, and let's just bring this one into focus, and let's draw up a plan on what we're going to be making. So 35 inch from top to bottom. So we need to remember that when we go into modeling it. 23 to 28 inch in diameter. So that's going to be interesting in terms of trying to work that one out. It probably depends on what type of barrel we're making. So we'll just average it and say about 24 inches across. The individual components that we'll need to think about modeling are the wooden portions. We'll have to think about the metal bands, and we'll have to think about the metal rivets that hold the bands in place. And for the wood, we actually have two components to think about. We have the side pieces and the top piece. So that's our wooden barrel in a nutshell. That's what we're going to be making. So it's relatively simple. Let's start modeling.
Okay, so we're in 3ds Max now, and in the bottom left hand corner you can see when I middle click or left click or use the scroll wheel or press a mouse button or a keyboard button, you can see what I'm pressing. So if you ever need to know what keyboard shortcut I'm using, you can just have a look down in the bottom left hand corner. So let's get our scene set up. So we've had a quick Google search and we know what our measurement system is going to be. We're looking for inches, and we can just go up to customize unit setup, and we can change it to centimeters, millimeters, and metrics, or directly below that is the imperial system for inches, feet, etc. So I'm just going to set it to inches. And I'm going to go over and make a cylinder, and this is the starting point for our barrel. I'm going to come over to the Modified tab, and I'm just going to change some of these parameters. I'm going to set it to be 35 inches. I'm going to set the radius of the barrel to be roughly in between what Google gave us the option for. And you can see here I'm just using the keyboard shortcut to toggle edge faces on and off, so that's F3 and F4. I'm going to change some things like the height segments, the cap segments, and then I'm just going to convert it to an editable poly. Now I'm going to use the edge selection here. I'm going to try and get that curve of the barrel, that distinctive bulbous shape. So I'm just using my edge selection and the scale function. And you can see I've got that shape just by selecting them and scaling them up, so that nice curve of that barrel that we need to actually get in there. Now there are multiple ways that I could have done that exact same thing, so I'm just going to undo this and I'm going to show you the soft selection. Now the soft selection is essentially a fall off selection. So the bigger the fall off, so you can see here it's color coded. So red is the most influential, blue is the least. And you can see as I pull that out, it automatically gives us that bulbous shape because it's pulling the middle out more than the edges. So if I pull it right down, it has a small influence. If I pull it right up, it has a much larger influence. So that's our rough shape. And if I double click these loops and use the scale tool at the top, I'm trying here to get that distinctive curve indentation at the top of the barrel, because all of the lids of the barrel always drop in ever so slightly. So I'm just going to use my select tool. You can see I've selected both the top and the bottom here, and I'm going to jump over to my bevel function over here. Now the bevel function is going to extrude and scale at the same time. So it allows me to push it in and scale it up to actually. So you can see after I've done that bevel and we have a look at the polygons, you can see we're left with this faceted edge around, and that's because if we go over to our smoothing groups in our face selection, we can see that there are two smoothing groups on this object. We're going to select all. The front faces are smoothing group 4, the top is smoothing group 1, and these faceted edges don't have a smoothing group. So if I select all of these and give them a smoothing group of 4, you see now that that faceting result disappears, and this is because we're smoothing all of those polygons, and because they're a different smoothing group to the surrounding polygons, you get nice sharp creased edges around them, so you get smooth, sharp, smooth, like that. So be aware of that when you're looking and working on your models. Now, okay, so we've got our bulbous shape and we've got our indentation at the top and the bottom, which is looking nice. Now I'm just going to duplicate this object, so I can hold Shift click when moving, it'll actually make a duplicate object of it. And if I use Alt Q, it's going to isolate that object, and I can use End Isolate in the right click menu to toggle out of that. So Alt Q will just isolate one object. So the next thing we need to look at is making these metal bands. Okay, and while we're talking about shift click dragging to make a copy, so we can just do the shift and drag out. We can also actually, if we have the second option down here, is an instance. Now if we make an instance of an object, what it does is it allows us to, whatever happens to the first object also happens to the second object, which can be really useful. But I'll just make a copy for now. You can see here that the copy doesn't alter the second one. So our next job in this modeling process is to model these metal bands that go across the top and the middle. And you can see that there's a metal band at the very top and the very bottom. So I need to try and create this. So there's many ways I can do this. So let's start with doing a selection. I select this entire loop. I can use the extrude tool over here, and if I use it, you can see it goes up or down, but that's not really very useful for what we want to do. We want that metal band to come outwards. So if I click on the little settings tab, I can actually change this from group selection to actually local normal selection. So we've learned that normal maps are the direction a polygon's facing. So by changing it to local normal, I'm saying extrude based on the direction that polygon is facing. So you can see as it pulls in or out in that direction. So I'm just going to set this to nice and low. And once I've got a value, I can just hit the tick and the OK button. Okay, so we've got that. So I'm just going to select the bottom loop, and I'm going to use the settings tab and just hit OK again. So it's going to apply those exact same settings. Now I want those middle loops. So I'm going to use the chamfer function just to give myself a bit of a thinner loop to work with. See these second ones across. And then I'm going to select both of those loops like so, and apply the exact same extrude with those exact same settings. So that leaves me with a barrel shape that has these extrusions at the top, bottom, and in the middle that are all the same size. Okay, so I'm going to try and get rid of this blue color to start with. So I'm just going to come up here to the top panel and then open my material editor. So this is the slate material editor, and I'm just going to drag out a standard material, and using the end node, I'm just going to drag it onto the object. And from here, I can click it and I can just change the color to whatever I want. Now, while we're in the material editor, let's have a look at just some ways of visualizing our barrel. So I'm just going to select the metal sections, where bits that are going to be metal bands of my object. And on the right hand side, you see I hit this thing called material ID. So if I change that material ID to 2, and then I'm just going to invert my selection, and I'm going to make sure the wood is set to material ID 1. I can then drag out a multi-sub object. I'll change this set number of materials to 2. So you see I've got 2 slots. I can drag that brown standard material into slot 1, and I'll make a second standard material in slot 2, and I'll just drag this multi-sub onto this object. Oop. There we go, and you can see wherever I set that material ID to 2 is now grey, and wherever I set it to 1 is now brown, which can be very useful for lots of different purposes, but for this we're actually just using it for visualizing our object. Okay, so that was one way of making that metal loop, is using the extrude method. So we selected the polygons, and then we extruded out those metal bands. Another method would be to actually create a separate band. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to do the exact same thing I did before. I'm going to select that loop, but instead of extruding I'm just going to use the scale tool and hold shift at the same time. And you can see we're separating out an extra ring here, and I can create that, clone that object as a separate entity. So I'm just going to call this metal ring. I'm going to give that the grey colour so we can visualize it. And so we can start seeing that this allows us to do lots of different things now, because this is a separate object, we can start manipulating it. But before we do that, you'll notice that the pivot point is actually right down here at the bottom. So to adjust that, I just go to the third tab, and in here I can change my pivot and say effect pivot only, center to object. And now I can scale and rotate it as I need, and it's the center of that object, not the bottom of the barrel, which is useful. Now I'm just going to manipulate this shape a little bit, just using the scale and move tool on the edge selection. I'm just going to make it a little bit narrower.
Okay, and I'm going to use the shell modifier here, and what the shell modifier allows us to do is give this polygon shape a bit of thickness without actually affecting the polygon. So I can go down the stack back to the editable poly, and I can readjust it as I see fit, but always go back to that shell modifier above for some thickness. Now I'm going to break these polygons here, so I use the break function, and now it's split those vertices apart. And what I'm going to aim to do here is overlap that metal band. So I'm going to hold shift and drag out, and I'm going to sort of extrude an edge using the shift, and I'm going to get a little bit of a curved end to it. So I'm just going to scale this down, but you'll notice as I scale here is that it doesn't scale along the edge of the edge of the polygon correctly. So at the top I've just changed it from view to local, and now you'll see it follows that edge correctly. And then I go back up to shell, and we've got that thickness back. So the modifier shell allows us to go up and down that viewport. Now that little tick box underneath the stack looks like a little test tube or something like that. That's actually to view the end result of the modifier stack while manipulating the thing at the very bottom. So I've got my edit polyfill selected, and I can do that. Use the little test tube to see what's going on. Now just given it all the same smoothing group there, same as we looked before, just get rid of that faceted edge, and you can see we've got a ring now that overlaps our surface, which is quite nice. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to select these two rings, and I'm just going to scale it up. So I'm going to create that second loop that we were doing before, but I'm going to do it the same method that we just did then. I'm going to select this central loop here. Once I've fixed the pivot point, select this central loop. I'm going to use chamfer, same as we did, and I'm going to select the middle loop, invert and delete. So I've got a nice thin loop in the middle now that follows the contours of the barrel. Going to just duplicate the exact same thing. Now I can use the copy and paste, so I make sure I've got the same thickness of band as the top one. Come back down, do that break function. I'm just repeating the same functions again as I did before. I'm just going to do shift click drag out, and shift click drag out. Make sure this is set to local, and just scale a little bit. Put that shell modifier back on. And there we go, we've got two overlapping bands now. Now you can see we've got the top bands and the bottom bands, which are sort of mirrors of each other. So there's a few different ways we could potentially do this. I could just clone and drag it out, or I could use the mirror function here and just drag outwards and say do a copy. Or what I'm actually going to do here is use another modifier called the symmetry modifier, and I'm going to position the mirror of this symmetry modifier in the center of the barrel, so that whatever happens to the top ring will edit down and go on to the bottom ring. I'm going to do the same thing with this middle one. Just drag the mirror down and get it aligned in the middle. And there we go, we've got our four overlapping bands using shift expand to create an extra object, using the shell modifier to give some thickness, and using the symmetry modifier to duplicate that object to the bottom. Okay, so I've just ended isolation there, and we're going to come back to this first barrel that we worked on using the extrude method. So it's just two different ways we could approach this, and actually the number of ways that we can approach modeling a barrel goes up and up the more you know about 3D modeling. So let's just come back to this slightly simpler one, and I'm going to put those little rivets that we saw in our reference images into this barrel, and I'm just going to do this with a cylinder. I'm going to start off with my primitive. I'm just going to lower those height segments right down, and I'm just going to lower the poly count down because it doesn't need to be very high poly. I'm going to convert it to an editable poly, and I'm going to select the back faces here of this object. So if I just isolate and select all, but then deselect those ones and just delete them. Now the reason why I've done that, it'll become apparent in a second. So I'm just going to pull these out, give it a little bit of roundness, select that vert and pull that out as well to match. And end isolation, and I'm going to push this rivet into the surface of this object. So because we've deleted the back faces of this little cylinder, if we overlap it with the mesh, no one will ever see the back face of it, so we don't need those extra polygons. They don't need to be visible. So I'm just going to insert them like so. And I'm just going to make an instance here, and as we saw before, anything I do to the original happens to the instance. And again, I'm going to shift drag these two down once I've just given them a bit of colour. Make them a little bit bigger actually once I've put that colour on them. You can see if I scale the verts, the second one scales along with it, so I don't need to, that instance has come in handy as opposed to a copy. So again, shift, drag down, make an instance, position those on the surface. And in this case, I'm going to do a mirror instance. And you can see here I actually ticked the wrong orientation. So it's actually on the y-axis that I want. And I'm going to push these down. But before I do that, I'm going to change it from local to world so they actually scale. They transform on the correct orientation instead of moving away from the barrel. Just have to position them, and there we go. So now we've got our barrel with our rings round and our rivets holding it in place. So I've just dropped in a skylight there just to be able to see what it looks like with a little bit of ambient occlusion. And I'm just going to offset these so they're not quite as uniform. They're not all the same as you go down. A little bit of irregularity helps. So that's our barrel essentially modelled now. We've got most of the characteristics here. We've got the little rivets, we've got the bands that go around, we've got the indentation at the top. Looking at this reference on the right, I can actually see this indentation is probably a little bit too low, so I'm just going to raise that up just a tad. And do the same thing at the bottom. Just to match that reference a little bit. So this is why it's so important to do a little bit of research, a little bit of reference beforehand. Okay, so the next job, after now we've got all of these key features modeled out, is to UV map this object. So in order to check my UVs before I start anything, I'm just going to go and get a checker pattern. I'm going to place it on this object. So I'm just going to select all and say assign material to object. And I'm going to say show in viewport, this little tick box here in the material editor. Come back to my checker pattern and give increase the tiling, so 20 by 20 should be enough to see what's going on. So you can see once I've applied that checker pattern on the surface, I'm just going to go in and So you can see actually we've got a grey top straight away. So if I open up my unwrap UV modifier and open up the UV editor, and I select that top, you can see actually it's because that top face is actually completely flat, so it has no thickness whatsoever, so it appears grey instead of that checker pattern. So I'm just going to do a quick planar map to see, and you can see there you go, now we're getting that checker pattern on the object. So we definitely have some work to do here to be able to get these UVs as flat as possible. So we're going to be trying to make sure that we have a logical distribution of UV islands, but also that there's very little distortion across the whole surface. So when we look at the sides here, they have got a little bit of stretching involved in them. So I'm going to start off by selecting this first metal band at the top, and I'm just going to do a cylindrical unwrap. So I'm going to do the same thing again, just select that band. I'm going to press the grow selection to make sure I've got all that metal part, and I'm going to use my projection type here of cylindrical projection. And you can see once I scale that projection out a little bit, we get a much better result for that checker pattern. And I'm just going to repeat this all the way down to the bottom on each of these metal bands. Now the reason why I'm going to select the metal bands only and not the whole barrel is I want to help myself later on in the texturing process. So I'm going to split these out by material types this time for the purpose of texturing. Now the whole point of UV mapping is to flatten out a 3D object into a 2D space, which can be a little bit tricky at times. It's almost like a little jigsaw puzzle in itself, but if we get it right, we can have a much easier time of texturing. Now you can see here I forgot when to select the little overlap of the band, so I'm just going to repeat that one with select cylindrical projection and scale it up. So the next thing I'm going to do is look at the wood, the second material. So I'm going to select the top one, to repeat essentially this entire process, scale, second one down, scale, and so on. And I'm just trying to separate all of my materials out so it becomes a little bit easier to work with. And that's essentially the first thing you want to do with UV unwrapping. Get to grips with where each part of your 3D model is in the UV editor. It can be tricky at times when you're beginning out to work out what part of the model belongs where. So first thing is start selecting, start unwrapping, and start working out where each part of your model is going to go. So as I'm going through here, I'm just going to select the bottom loop again and doing nothing fancy other than selecting that cylindrical projection at the moment. We'll come to making sure these are not distorted in any way later on. At the moment we're just working out what's going on. Okay, so we've got the top of our barrel and we've also got the bottom. Now you'll see if I move the top section out the way, let's put it to one side and do a drag selection, you can see my bottom is here completely flat and almost invisible in the UV window. Now if I do a planar projection, you can start seeing, there you go, I can get it to look like the top and we have a checker pattern. I'll just move those to one side until we need them later on. So let's start with these wooden sections. And there's a little bit of stretching here, so I could use the scale tool to get them to be nice square checkers, but I'm just going to come up to tools, relax tools, and I'm going to use the polygonal angle relax function just to flatten out this so that we have nice square undistorted UVs on here. And then I'm going to scale them all to be roughly the same, holding control while I do this so I'm not distorting them while I scale. Here we go, and we'll get them all to fit in roughly the same size. And as I zoom in here, you'll notice that we've got this little green split. So this is my UV island that's split apart during the projection process. So these two verts belong together. So you can see that little blue dot as I select it says where it belongs. So I'm going to use my weld threshold function down here on the right just to snap those back together. And we have a nice UV island that is surrounded by a green seam. Okay, so that's my wooden sections, and we've got them pretty uniform. We can see the checker pattern on the right is nice and square, and I'm just going to use the straighten function just to get a nice straight edge on these. Try and keep it as clean as possible, because the cleaner it is, the later on in the texturing process, the easier it would be. Now I could have done the same thing by just using these align functions right here. So align vertical and align horizontal. So sometimes you have to do it manually. Sometimes the automatic algorithm doesn't quite work as you expect it to. So sometimes you want to go in manually. So let's just position these a little bit closer. It's looking pretty good. And we'll move on. Let's scale this just a tad, and we'll move on to our metal section now. So before we do, I'm just going to scale this down and place it into my UV 0 to 1 space. So this little square box on my UV editor is where we want to position our UV islands. So I'm just going to position those at the bottom. Like so. So we know the bottom of our UVs is our wooden side part. So let's move on to these metal sections now, these metal bands. Now you can see here we have a couple of issues that we need to solve. First is we have the same issue that we had before. We have these verts that are broken, so I'm just going to select and weld, double check the other end. Use a planar polygonal angle relax function to get some nice square UVs, but you can see it curved as I did that. That's because this barrel is slightly curved, so the algorithm's trying to flatten it out as best it can, but struggling in the process. So I'm going to use my straighten function, and you can see where we go. The first time it rotated it, so I just turned off rotate, and we're going to move on to the second one. I'm going to do the same function. Use a relax and a straighten, and we'll have a look and see what that result is. So what I'm trying to do is go through and select each one of these UV islands, make sure that there's no breaks in the seam, and make sure they're as flat and uniform as possible by using either the relax tool, the scale tool, the manipulation of vertices, edges and faces, or the straighten. So you can see this one again is curved. So once I've flattened it using the relax tool, I'm just going to straighten it along the horizontal. So the whole purpose of UVs is to make sure that we have a clean, uniform surface to paint on when we begin our texturing process. And the longer, sometimes UVs sometimes seem a little bit tedious, seem a little bit annoying, and something that you think should be an automated process, and there are tools out there to actually automate the UV process for you, but I've always found that if you spend a little bit of time with your UVs, making sure they're not distorted, they're as clean and as uniform as possible, you end up having a easier time with the texturing process than you would do otherwise. So as I'm going through here, just scaling and manipulating these. So again, the only tools, functions that we've used so far are the planar projection, the cylindrical projection. We've used the polygonal relax function and the straighten. Everything else has just been scale and move in terms of our selection of these faces. Okay, so now we've got the wood and the metal sections sorted. You'll see we can come to the top, and we've got this edge which will be wood, and we've got the top which will also be wood. But those are going to be two different types of wood in terms of the direction the grain is going to go, the grain of the wood. So I'm going to select the top and split it out using planar projection. So you can see here I've just got the top on its own. And I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom. So just select the actual bottom, not the ring, the edge that goes around it, planar, and scale it down. So make sure I turn that planar function off. So this is where the wood grain in our reference image goes in the opposite direction of the side. So having those as a separate piece will help us quite a lot in the texturing process. So this top ring, I'm just going to do the same thing that we did before. I'm just going to select it all, and I'm going to use the cylindrical projection mode in order to flatten it out. So there we go. So we've got this. I'm going to scale it. You can see we've got this result, which if we zoom in closely, we'll notice that there's a little bit of overlapping UVs here. So instead of having a pure green seam around the outside, we've actually got the inner white seam sat on top. So I'm going to select this outside loop and pull that down, and you'll see now that what we've got is that green line that goes all the way around. We've got on the right hand side a little break right there, so I'm just going to weld that together. And we've also got this polygon sat on the edge which belongs on the other side to make it uniform, so it's going to break it off. I'm going to stitch it back into place. So I'm just going to use the vertex mode, and I'm just going to position these roughly where they need to go, and just do a threshold weld. Do a quick relax and a quick straighten, and we've got something that's usable now for that edge, which is great. Now I'm going to repeat the whole process again over here on this other one. Cylindrical, stretch it out, double check our UVs, that there's a nice seam going all the way around the outside. Pull that out, and the same thing's happened here. We've got one that's floating, so I'm going to break it off, put it to the other side, and weld that in place, like so. And we've just done the same thing that we've done multiple times, just straighten them out, and I'm just going to get them roughly the same time. So I was using the packing function down in the bottom right hand corner there just to scale them to roughly the same size, like so. And now what I'm going to do is try and keep these together. So I'll start off by scaling into this gap. So we've got all our wood at the bottom and all our metal at the top, and you can see there's a little bit of overlap here. Not sure when that happened, but we'll just go in and clean it up. So let's just select all the wooden pieces, move those down a bit. So the metal, this metal piece can go at the top, this metal piece can go at the bottom. So I'm going to try and keep it as organized as possible. So I'm going to work from top to bottom of my model to top to bottom of my UVs. And then move this wood into place. I'm just trying to fill in as much of this UV space as I can. I don't really want to waste any UV space, or try not to, at least anyway. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to go over to my materials and just increase, just double check this seam right here. You can see this green line that runs parallel to vertically up the barrel. Actually, you can see it's staggered, so on all of the metal pieces it's on the right, and all on the wood piece it's on the left. And to reduce any errors in my texture later on, I'm just going to try and get that as a straight line. Now, I could have done this earlier on when we were doing the cylindrical mapping, but let's just fix this now. So you can see here, I'm just going to move these across to the other side. So the same thing we did with the top and bottom earlier. Break it off, and we're going to come through, and I'm just going to use the stitch function on these. And I'm going to use the weld function on these ones. So just select there and do a threshold weld. Now you can see every now and again I forget to turn off select all, so that little box, the fourth one along on the bottom bar, is select all. So there we go, we've now got a seam that runs all the way down our barrel. Got seams that go around the top, bottom, and around every material, which so I got to choose pack just to get those into place. That's my wood, she's looking good. Let's reduce the padding just to get that to fit a little bit tighter. And now this is just me trying to work out the best way of filling the space. It's like almost like playing a game of Tetris at this point. How to fill up that space as efficiently as possible and as organized as possible. So working out what's the best order to put things in, so you know at a later point that you're not going to be struggling to work out what part of your UV belongs to which part of the model, so it becomes easier texturing. And just like the modeling process earlier where we had two different ways of demonstrating the same thing, there are multiple different ways to UV. So this is what I'm showing you here isn't the only method and the be all end all of it. There are countless other ways of achieving very similar results. We could have just done this as one solid barrel and just done a cylindrical map around the whole thing and kept it as one piece. I've decided to split it off as materials to help later on in the texturing, so it becomes a little bit simpler for the texturing process. We could have done it as a half and a half, or we could have done it top to bottom. There's different ways of UVing this process. Now, you can see here I'm just tweaking some of these UVs. So if I put the checker pattern on, you'll see that our checker here isn't getting fully square. Got a little bit of an elongated version, and if we look closely, it's because we have essentially an overlapping edge. So you can see here we've got a large polygon, but actually you can see it belongs slightly higher. So we've got the middle polygon sat on top of each other. So you can see here, I pull this edge up, we pull this other edge down, and there we go, we get like a nice checker pattern there appearing. So essentially we had the edges inverted on top of each other, so the top was actually at the bottom and the bottom was actually top instead of the other way around. So just moving those can helped us achieve that undistorted UV checker pattern. And this is sometimes the case. You might have to go through and tweak and edit and look and just try and find out what's going on in terms of those UVs. This is why the likes of a checker pattern, and if you do look at other ones, sometimes they have numbers on them or color gradients. They're all designed to help you analyze and work out the best way of creating a good UV layout. And we're just going through the same process we did before, just flattening and double checking these all the time, making sure that they're all okay. And we'll just go through this whole process. So I'm just going to continue this in the background, and you'll notice that we're not doing anything different to what we've done before. We're just double checking all of these, making sure that the green seam's at the top. Here you go, switching this round now, making sure that this edge is at the top and this edge is at the bottom, and that now gives us a good checker pattern. So obviously we had a little bit of distortion earlier, but we fixed that with just a little bit of tweaking. So I'm really being really finicky here, making sure these are the same width. Now what I'm just doing here is reordering them, making it goes from top to bottom. So the top band's at the top of the UV and the bottom band's at the bottom of the UV. And same here, just double checking. So at some point during my packing earlier and just tweaking of the UVs, I've misaligned them again, misorganized them. So just going through tweaking. So sometimes this happens during the UV process. You might have to go back and retweak them just to get the exact layout that you're after. Okay, same thing, just being really finicky here, making sure they're the same. So as I go through making sure these UVs laid out, we're going to remember, we'll recap, it's all about having that 3D object laid out onto a 2D plane. So the way I like to imagine it is if it's a teddy bear. So if you were to unstitch all of the thread that held that teddy bear together, what you end up is a flat pattern out of the fabric. And now there might be different types of fabric that you use for that bear. You might have a brown fur, and then sort of like a soft suede for the paws and the bottom of the feet. Now what I'm doing here is the same thing. I'm separating out into different fabrics, different materials, and laying that out so I can cut it out of the fabric and then sew it together. So the green lines are the seams, and we're going to sew those together and inflate it, or if it was a teddy bear, we're going to stuff it full of fabric and stuffing, and then inflate that bear so it's nice and firm. That's essentially what we're doing with this 3D object, is moving, deciding where we're going to make those cuts, deciding how we're going to make this 3D object out of a 2D shape. So if any of you are really good at papercraft, this is essentially the same thing. So papercraft is UV wrapping inverted. Essentially, you start with the UVs to create the 3D object. So what I just did there was I just increased the tile amount from 20 to 50, just so I can get a much denser UV checker, so I can actually start seeing whether this pattern is actually distorting or not. So you can see once I increased it, we had a little bit of stretching, especially here on this bottom one. Let's pull that up, extend it up just a little bit to get that flattened shape. So I'm just going to make sure these are roughly the same size. And I'm just overlaying them just so I can get them to be matched. Okay, so that's looking pretty good on the right hand side now. You can see we don't have a huge amount of distortion. We've got a nice seam that goes from top to bottom, and we've got our separate materials split up, and we've got a nice gap on the top right if we need anything else to be placed into that zone. So for instance, our little rivets still need to go into that UV checker, into that UV space once we're done. So it's all looking pretty clean. So the next thing is to do these the UVs of these little rivets. Now the nice thing is, because we did an instance earlier, we only need to do UV one of them, and all of them will become UV, because whatever happens to the first will happen to the ones after them. So if I just apply my checker pattern now to these objects, to these little rivets, and we zoom in and we have a look what's going on with these. I'm just going to planar, and I'm just going to do best alignment. There we go. We can see we have a really dense checker pattern, so it's really quite uniform and neat on the front, but down the side it's really stretched. So I'm just going to do another polygonal unwrap, and you can see now that we've got a nice checker pattern across that surface. Inside of our UV space now though, we've only got that one rivet on its own, so we need to actually, if I select all of them, so all the rivets and the barrel at the same time, and apply an unwrap UV modifier to all objects, you see there we go, we've got our rivet in that selected with those UVs, so we can position it roughly where we need it to be in that space. Now I could also, instead of just doing select all and using an unwrap, I could also attach my rivets to the barrel, which I will do before exporting. So the only step now is we've molded it, we've got the shape we want, we've unwrapped it, we've given it some UVs that are all nice and neat and organized based on materials. There's also there's no distortion. The only thing we need to do next is render our UV template. So we go to our edit UV, tools, render UVW, set our settings here. So I'm going to do 1024 by 1024, and I'm going to copy this UV map out, and we're going to take it into Photoshop for our texturing phase, because that's the next part of this process. I'm going to paste that in, ready to start texturing. So I'm going to start off by just doing a quick material mask. So I'm just going to use the square selection tool. I'm going to select the wooden parts of my barrel first, and just on a new layer, I'm just going to fill that with a brown color. So that's going to be where my wood's going to be. I'm going to select where my metal is going to be, like so, and I'm just going to fill that with grey. I'm going to do the same thing up here with these two top parts. So this is again the very top of my barrel. Use the circle selection. I'm holding shift to make sure it's a nice uniform circle, and space to move it around. Just hold Control Alt to duplicate, and shift to move it to the right without moving up or down. I'll use the lasso tool just to select where the rivet's going to be. I'm just going to fill that. So this is my quick and dirty mask, essentially, just of where my materials are. So I've done that as a ever slightly darker grey, just for later on, because that's going to be ever slightly different material to the band, because it's a rivet as opposed to just the pure metal. And I'm going to save this out. I'll just put this on the desktop. You can do a folder, call this one Wooden Barrel Tutorial. And I could save this as a PNG or a Targa or a TIFF, an image file format, but because I'm going to be continually working on this, I'm actually just going to save it out as a pure PSD at the moment, because I'm going to load this in as I work on it, so I can do quick saving. So I press Control S in Photoshop, and that'll just save it straight to PSD, and that'll automatically refresh itself inside of our viewer. Okay, so I need to get my material here. I'm just loading that PSD. Let's use it as a collapsed layer, so I don't want the individual layers, I just want it as the final image output. You can see, there we go, we've got our barrel, and it's got our colours on this object. Brown where the wood's going to be, grey where the metal's going to be, and a slightly darker grey where our rivets are going to be. So back over here in Photoshop, I'm going to start applying some source images. So I've got this image of some wooden planks here. Now this could have been a photo, or it could have something I found on Google, or anything. But I'm going to apply this to my texture, and the interesting thing, what a lot of people tend to do, is they'll bring it in and they'll distort and they'll stretch our image to fit that gap. which is, you don't want to ever do that. You don't want to destroy the pixels that are from your source reference. So I'm going to use a layer mask over here. So down here, I just created a folder, and using the little layer mask option, I've created a selection based on that brown wooden area, and I've placed that source image in the folder. What the layer mask will allow me to do is essentially mask off anything that isn't in that brown region. So here I can now sort of duplicate and manipulate this bit of wood, this image of some wood, and position it so that it's going to start filling this space, but it's never going to leave the confines of that selection. So my initial selection I did as soon as I brought the UVs into Max and now into Photoshop, and now going to be really helpful for just laying out the position of these planks. And I'm just going to keep doing this. I'm going to duplicate this again, and so click drag, duplicate. I'm just going to position this somewhere useful. I'm just trying to lift this up and make sure there's no obvious repeating patterns. So I've got this now. I've got this bit of wood that's been masked off based on that selection. So I'm going to do the same thing again, but with these top circular parts. So make a new group, mask it based on that selection. I'm going to copy this source reference of some wood into that group and just position it vertically like this. Do the same with the next. Now the reason why I'm working this way is that currently I'm working in a non-destructive way, so at no point am I really editing the original pixels of this image. If I want to go back and manipulate these, I can do, and I'll just press, if I go and just do a save, so I did Control S, so I'm waiting for that PSD to save now, and I come back to Max, and if it doesn't load automatically, I can just hit this reload button, and you can see now I've got my wooden planks that are going vertically, and then at the top I've got my planks that are going horizontally, and all of that is because I spent time with my UVs making sure that the seams are in the correct place. So essentially I've got a lot of the hard work on this texturing process done for me just through that UV position of the 3D model. So I'm just going to pull in some texture reference here of a bit of metal. Okay, so this little source image that I've got here, I'm going to do the same process. I'm going to select, I'm going to group, I'm going to use the layer mask. I'm going to try and work as non-destructively as I can for as long as I can in my texturing process, really utilizing the benefits of Photoshop, which is its layering system. So I'm going to get this to be roughly the right texel density, so I don't want this image I've got of this metal is really quite close up, sort of zoomed in. So I'm just going to scale it down so it's roughly the same texel density as the wood, and I'm just going to mask and this one image off on its own here, get a really soft brush and just get rid of that seam on the right hand side and the left hand side. So at the moment I'm just laying down some image reference to get the rough material properties of this object. I'm not thinking about detail, I'm not thinking about how the wood is going to be worn and where, and whether there's scratches or dinks on it or anything like that. I'm just getting the rough material properties in place. So you can see here we've got what looks roughly like metal on those bands, and last but not least, just going to do this little rivet. Let's mask it off. going to paste in some of that metal, get the textile density right for that rivet by scaling and positioning. There we go. I'm just going to make that rivet a tad darker. And there, when we save it out, there we go. So we've got our very rough texture in place now. We've got our definition of where our wood is going to be, got a definition of where our metal is going to be. The next thing is to export this object into a real-time renderer. So I'm just going to go to File, Export Selected, and I'm going to export this as an OBJ, or I could export it as an FBX as well, because we're going to take this into Marmoset Toolbag. Now we could take it into a lot of different real-time renderers, so something like Unreal Engine or Unity, which are both free to go and download. But I'm just going to use Marmoset as it's quite a nice little 3D model viewer. Okay, so what I've done there is go to File, Import, and I've located that that OBJ file. And now on the right hand side is where I can load in my materials. So I've gone over to the albedo slot and I've loaded in that PSD that we've been working on out of Photoshop. Now I'm just going to go in and quickly adjust the lights. So on the left hand side I've gone to the sky and I've picked a HDRI that has a directional light source to it. So I just clicked on the image and created a light. And I'm just setting this up now so I can view my model as we texture it. Okay, so I'm just using Shift and left click here to rotate this skybox around so I can see my texture and get a good idea of what I need to work on it with. So let me jump back here into Photoshop. I'm just going to collapse all these folders down a little bit and group those. So this is going to be my diffuse. It's always good to keep as tidy as possible as you're working. Now I'm just going to duplicate that selection box that I made and just make a very temp specular. So a specular map is essentially the shininess value of my material. So when we break up what a texture is, it's essentially how does light interact with a surface. What's the material properties? So when we say specular, we're talking about how much light is being reflected off the surface or how shiny that surface becomes. Where black is not shiny at all and white is very shiny. So I've just made a very temporary specular here with the metal bits being light grey and the wood bits being very dark grey, almost black. And I just loaded that into the specular channel just to get a better idea. So this is just for testing purposes, just to test to see how it's going. And you saw there I just increased that gloss value. So that gloss value is saying not only how shiny it is, but how tight that specular highlight is. Is it mirrored or not? And when you start looking at PBR and how PBR works, that breaks down into a little bit more complication. But as a beginner level, you basically want to know for a specular map how shiny your surface is. Okay, so now we've got our main texture. What I'm going to start doing now is start enhancing these textures a little bit, enhancing these images, start thinking about so far we've got essentially some wood and we've got some metal, but I want to start thinking about how that wood and that metal actually would naturally wear down, would naturally interact with the environment. So what I'm doing here is I'm just taking my UV mask, my UV template, and I've put it to the top and just set it to screen mode so I can see through it. And I'm just using the marquee selection tool to essentially make another mask. Now this mask is for the individual wood parts. Okay, so when we look at our reference image again, we can see here on all of these barrels, wherever the wood meets and interacts with the metal, you get this darkening of the wood, this grime, this dirt that gathers in the creases and edges. So what we're looking to create here is a detailing on this wooden texture that's going to allow us to mimic that real life effect that the wood and the metal interaction has. So whenever we talk about textures, we want to try and look as much reference as we can and recreate the way that a material in real life behaves. So I've got a couple of sort of grime textures here. So I'm just going to load one of them in. And I'm going to use that mask that we just created to make sure that it's only going to be applied to the center of this wooden portion right here. So in theory we know now, because of those UVs, because I laid them out wood, metal, where I've masked is going to be the intersection between the wood and the metal portion. So I'm just going to set this to a multiply. And I'm just going to duplicate it across quickly and crudely. And you can see we've got this nice hard edge of this grime coming down. And if I save it, you can see now that it's over in Marmoset, it's visible on that intersection point. I'm just going to repeat this quite quickly for the rest of these sections, so I'm not going to be too precious about it for the purpose of this demo. When you're making your own barrel, you might want to alternate these, make them slightly different for each one, but for now this will do. I'm just gonna, so where I've got that intersection, you see, because I've made that mask, it's nice and easy to get where that metal actually interacts with that wood. So all of this comes down to that UV time that I spent making sure that the UVs were nice and clean and organized, and this allows me now to very quickly position this little bit of grime. And so when we save it, we start seeing that it gathers where it's naturally going to supposed to gather. So I'm just duplicating that wood a little bit. I'm just going to desaturate it and just make it a little bit darker. I feel like it naturally should be a little bit darker. This is again part of the texturing process, comes down to artistic preference. I'm going to set this as a colour overlay, just to bring back a little bit of that brown hue, and I'm quite liking that as a colour to start with. You can see we still need to work on that top section. So I'm just going to repeat the process again now, but for the metal sections. I'm going to make another mask. So this time I'm just going to make it blue so I differentiate between the metal and the wood. Okay, so I'm just going to bring in this second image here, and what I'm after is this little rusted element in the bottom of the image, and I'm going to try and get that to sit along the edge of the metal band, so where the band wraps around and curves under, so the very sharp cornered edge of it will have that slightly rusted, worn down look instead here. And again, all I'm doing is masking, using the selection tool, using the layer mask, and then positioning my image where I need to and manipulating as required. So I'm just going to duplicate this, mask, and just blend that in so it doesn't look quite as harsh. And same thing with this one, just blend that edge out, just using a soft brush here and just blending away. So when I save that and I jump back over to Marmoset, you can see that it's got that edge now that looks worn and a little bit more rusted than it did before. So I'm just going to continue this process, and I'm going to do this for all 4 metal bands. So I'm just going to speed through this as quickly as I can now, just to speed up this tutorial. And you'll see that I use a very similar technique. I'm not going to use any other techniques really than what we've already done at this point. I'm presuming a lot of your experience, if you're a beginner at Max, you're probably a beginner at Photoshop as well. So again, we're just using the move tool. They were using the layer masks. So we can see if I shift click, I can actually just manipulate the layer mask on its own, so it wasn't quite long enough to fill the frame. Just using the same techniques as we've done so far. So you can see more of the marquee selection. Things like Control J are to duplicate a layer quickly, so I don't have to drag it down. Control E, merge the layers down together. So you'll see me toggle between some of the tools, so like V for the move tool and E for the eraser tool, etc. So I'm just going to use my levels adjustment here, Control L, to just darken that base background color that we started with for the metal, so it matches a little bit of the foreground color that we've got now. So this will be the front section will be slightly darker than the side edges. So we can see the effect that that's having now in Marmoset. The metal bands are a little bit darker. You can see that rusting on the edges, and that gloss is actually having an effect. So we'll come back to the specular and the gloss a little bit later, once we've got our diffuse looking as good as it can do. So I'm going to come back to this wood down here. I'm just going to add some variation to some of the individual planks, so it doesn't quite look as uniform across the board. I want to add some variation as much as possible, so I'm just really subtle colour. I'm just going to erase out little bits just to add a little bit more complexity to the surface. So we can see, when we look at our reference, there's never a uniform colour across the board, so let's just lower that dark value just a little bit. And what I'll do now, I'll use Control D inside of Marmoset to duplicate my barrel, so I can have a look at it from the top and the bottom as well. So just have one on its side. It allows me to view what that barrel is going to look like at all angles. So I've just dragged in some random noise and dirt textures here, so it's just black and white images that I'm going to position and set to either multiply or color burn with just a really low opacity. Again, just to add some more variation. I don't want to be able to see repeating patterns. I don't want to be able to see the same wood grain, because the very first, when we started, we duplicated that wood texture 3 times. So essentially we've got multiple versions of the same plank. So a couple more just variations here, just to add a little bit of so this is just a black and white image, so I'm going to use it as just to add a little bit of subtlety variation, so you can see a little bit of lightness value in the bottom left hand corner and a little bit of darkness value in the top right. Oh, look at that again in Marmoset. So you can see I'm constantly toggling back and forward between Marmoset and Photoshop to see what effect my texturing process is having on the 3D object. Because sometimes it's quite difficult to see what's occurring inside of the 3D model when you're just focusing on the 2D texture. So having that ability to toggle back and forward is really, really useful. So you'll notice that the lighting's changed inside of Marmoset now. That's just because I took a little break and didn't press record when all I did was change the skybox, the skylight inside of Marmoset. So you'll notice that as we jump back and forward that the lighting's changed. So I'm going to take this opportunity now just to go back and do some cleanup. I'm going to go through and just name my layers, something useful so I know exactly what they're all doing. It's really important as you're working in Photoshop to essentially keep it clean and tidy, all the layers organized as much as possible, naming as many things as you can, because you never know when you might have to work with someone else on a particular texture. So you might be sharing a texture, or you might go away from it for a long time and then come back to it. So it's always worthwhile to go through and make sure that not everything is named layer 01, layer 02, layer 03, etc. So I'm just going to rename a few of these and then we'll continue the process of texturing. So we're going to be taking the details that we've been doing to the bottom bit of wood and we'll start applying those to the circular top and bottom pieces as well. So once I've done a little bit of tidy up in the layer stack, I'm going to bring in some more different variations of dirt and grime here. So here's a sort of like a bit of leaky rust, leaky water. So I'm going to use that just to add some more discoloration essentially to the wood. So setting it to an overlay blend. I mean, most of these things you'll notice are quite subtle once they go on, once you lower the opacity and you get it blended nicely. And it's not there to be sort of wow in your face, there's a big rust stain or anything like that. It's just to add some variations and subtlety to the process. I'm going to do the same thing I did before, add a little bit of variation to this, to individual planks. I just set it as a colour, set it as a multiply, lower the opacity, come in with the eraser brush and just get rid of a little bit. And you can see at the top I'm lowering my opacity of the brush just so it's not as a hard edge. So I'm going to start working on these top and bottom pieces, but to make the grime and dirt look a little bit more natural, I'm actually going to use the warp tool. So if you right click on an image, you can select warp and it allows you just to bend and manipulate that image So I'm going to try and get it to follow the contours of that circular shape a little bit more. So just using these controller points to get it to match the outline. But also at the same time trying to respect the direction of the wood. So trying not to let the ground go horizontally across some vertical grain. So just to keep it a little bit more natural. Again, just some extra images. So all I'm doing here, there's been very little hand painting of anything. So far, all we've been doing is photo manipulation. There are lots of other ways, but it completely depends on the art style that you're going for with your wooden barrel. So you might be going for very much a hand painted art style, or you might be going for something that's halfway in between. But at this point in the texturing phase, all we're doing is demonstrating some photo manipulation. So again, just using, just moving these little marks around a little bit, get a little bit of variation. I'm going to do the same thing we did before with just changing one plank color. So it just looks like it's a little bit stained, a little bit worn compared to others. Again, a quick toggle back to Marmoset to have a look at how it's progressing. I've got some more images here. So this one's sort of like a moss. So I'm going to pretend this wood barrel has maybe been out in the rain. Sometimes it helps to think of the backstory. Where has this barrel been? What's its purpose been in your game or in life? It can help trigger ideas for that texturing process. So I'm going to come down to the bit that's masked for the bottom wooden section and just place this So I'm going to come back and apply that same sort of mossy dirt texture, but to the metal this time, but only the bottom ring. I'm going to try and visually identify the top of the barrel and the bottom of the barrel. So if the bottom of the barrel has been sat on some grass or some wet surface, the bottom will have rusted and worn out a little bit quicker than everywhere else. So I'm just going to try and place that distinction. So I'm using my wireframe here to work out where the edge of the really thin top part of the bottom part of the barrel is. So that wooden bit that we separated from the bottom section. Make sure that's got a little bit of rust and worn and wear and tear on it. So when you look at the bottom, you can see that the moulding starts to match where the rest of the barrel is. So the next thing I'm going to focus on is the little rivets here. So you can see that they look quite flat and lifeless at the moment. And I don't actually know where they are on this object because the UVs are of the individual object. It's a floating object. So I'm going to use a program called XNormal. Now XNormal is designed to be a baking program, so it bakes a high poly to low poly model, but I'm actually going to use it to just generate an ambient occlusion of the model itself. So the way that XNormal works, if I right click on this high definition mesh here and just load in the the OBJ or the FBX that we exported from Max. I'm going to do the same for the low definition mesh, and then come down to baking options. And you can see there's lots of options in here, from normal maps to height maps, but I'm going to pick ambient occlusion. I'm going to set it to 1024 by 1024. I'm going to output as a PNG. So you can see, you saw that process is just almost ticking the little green box to set the output and ticking the little tick boxes. I'm going to set my padding to 4 so it doesn't go over the UV boundary by too much, and just hit generate maps. And you'll see it bakes out pretty quickly out of X normal. But you see this, straight away I can see there's a tiny little error here on the rivet, so it's a little bit black. So I'm just going to come back to my low definition mesh, and I'm just going to increase the ray distance. Now the ray distance is just essentially how far outside of the mesh do you want to look at. So it's just going to bake that again, and it's one of the first things you should always check if you're getting some errors in your bake for your ambient occlusion. And there we go, that's fixed it straight away. So XNormal, like I said, is a baking program, but I'm just generating a low poly AO here by having the same mesh in both channels. And when I load this on top of my diffuse and I set it to be multiply layer, see it adds a little bit of shadow detail. So this is all the contact shadows. I'm also going to duplicate this. I'm going to give it a color hue shift, so Control U, and do the same thing. So just to add a little bit of darkness, lower the opacity of it, it's a little bit too strong. And then I'm going to save this out. I'm going to have a look at it over in Marmoset. You can see how it adds a little bit, quite a lot of depth to that barrel. So I'll toggle these off, hit Control S. See it goes quite flat, toggle them back on. Quite a lot of depth straight away inside of that texture. Especially around those rivets begin to pop quite a lot. Okay, so I'm gonna make that specular that we need now, that texture map that's going to define the shininess value. But you can see where we've come from. We started with that just block out color, and we've added a lot of detail using just photo manipulation. So I'm just going to start out with a desaturated version of my diffuse, and I'm going to do it material by material. So I'm going to focus first on the wood. So I've just desaturated. I'm going to just black out completely that metal for now, so I can see just that wood value. I'm just going to adjust it using my levels adjustment, so Control L, just to get tiny little bits of highlights in there, but not much. And then I'm going to duplicate the diffuse again, but do the inverse. So I'm just going to delete out all the wood and just leave the metal. Control Shift U to make it go desaturated, so black and white, and then just use my levels adjustment again just to get a base value. So I'm trying to, you can see here, just adjusting it so that dirt is in the darker ranges, and that the highlights, little scratches on the corner, on the edges, are a little bit lighter. Going in and manually editing bits that I think that have not been that I couldn't get right just through a levels adjustment. And I'm just going to save this out as a specular map, just so we can see what's happening, what's occurring with this. So as I turn this on, you can see actually we get a nice little highlight across the edge. But we've also got to think about this specular. So the specular is either going to be really mirrored or really flat. So it's going to take that specular as an input and then say where it is shiny, how mirrored like is that shininess value going to be? How reflective is it going to be? So we need to actually define a gloss map as well. So I've just blocked in just the specular into the gloss channel, but I'm just going to start by duplicating the specular. And again, go in and adjust just this as I can get a rough value. So if we were going to be doing a true PBR texture, so physically based rendered texture, we'd have to go in and be a little bit more careful with this, making sure the gloss and the specular were PBR accurate. But I'm just going to do this by eye, just to get a rough value for this. You see, just again adjusting the bits that I need to be more reflective and adjusting the bits that I don't. So when you rotate this now, you can start seeing the edges where that specular is a lot lighter is starting to catch the light quite a bit. And we could go on and we could start texturing a little bit more. We could do things like convert this to a metalness gloss map. We could do normal maps, but we want to start looking at presenting this this barrel as well. So you might continue to work on your texture, make it even better than it is now, but I'm just going to jump into Marmoset and some of the features. So if you go to the skybox, you see we can toggle between some of these light sources, and we can add harsh lights or direct lights into this object. You can also add a shadow catcher. So you see what the shadow catcher does is it'll cast a shadow onto an imaginary floor. So there isn't really a floor there, but shadows will be cast as if there are. And we can sort of start playing with these HDR sky maps to see what is going to be the best map to show off our barrel. So we can also click on the image on the left hand side to add direct light sources. So we have the HDR, which is ambient light, and we have, if we click on and add a light, we can have a direct light source. And we can go into that light property that we've just dropped by clicking on it, and we can change the color, change the intensity. If we change this width value on the shape, you see we get a nice soft shadow instead of a hard shadow. So it's completely up to you how you present it. I also noticed that the barrel was actually floating, so make sure your object's always sat on the ground correctly. I'm just going to rotate this just a little bit. Okay. And if we come back to the sky here, we can also, if I toggle back to sky, this is the default mode. You can see the reflection of that HDRI image in the background. Or you can set it to blurred sky, where you can blur out the image, but you can still see the key features, the key brightness points and darkness points. Or you can set it color and just set it as any flat color you want. Or even ambient sky, which is going to take the ambient value of the entire scene and average them out. So you can see, I'm going to pick just a flat color for this one. We can also go up to add more lights. So we can add just generic lights in the scene. So Control U is to hide the interface. So I'll just bring it back there. You can see we can add a red light. We can position this wherever we want. So this is independent of that HDRI sky now. We can also come into our render settings, and we can toggle on things like ambient occlusion, which is going to be our sort of ambient shadows. We can toggle on front face and high res shadows. So these are going to start increasing the tax on your GPU a little bit, but you can also toggle on things like GI, which is global illumination, which is essentially the bounce light. So a way I can demonstrate this is if I set this to red, another material, and I drag it onto this barrel, you see that we get this bounce light cast onto the other barrel. If I toggle this on and off, you can see without it you don't get that bounce light, but with it you do. So you get that nice ambient global illumination. And the way you set this is with the voxel shape, so you just get that to fit your object. All of this information can be found on the Marmoset YouTube channel. They've got some really good introduction videos of the interface. Inside the camera, you can set things like depth of field and focal distance. You can set safe frame for rendering, which is useful to know what actually is going to render out of Marmoset when you hit the capture button. You can also do things like some post-processing. So I'm just going to position this a little bit down. It looks like it's still floating. Some post-processing down here, so we have full control over exposure, contrast. We've got a curve editor the same way that you would do in Photoshop to start adjusting the output. Some bloom. You don't want to use that too strong there. That's very, you want to use it sparingly. You can do vignettes for renders. You can add a little bit of grain and noise, so if you give it a sort of film grain look. But all of these you want to use sparingly, and you want to adjust them as you see fit. And you want to try and just adjust these values to get the best possible result. 'Cause Marmoset at the end of the day is a 3D modeling, 3D rendering software, so it's designed to make your models look as good as they can using all the bells and whistles. So once you've got your render, you might also want to show off the wireframe of your model, so people can see exactly how it was modeled, what the polygon layout is, etc. So a nice easy way to do that in Marmoset is just to toggle on wireframe under the render setting, and then I like to just drop a black material on everything, and then just set the sky color to be black also. And now you can see just the wireframe on its own, and you can use this in lots of different ways. You could set this to be a multiply over your main barrel in Photoshop, or you can just show it as is like this. There's lots of ways of presenting your 3D object now. And once you've got your render and you're happy with it, you just come up to the capture panel up here, and in capture settings you can set output resolution. So this is 1920 by 1080, and then if you've got to capture, you either capture it to a file or capture it to the clipboard, bring it over to Photoshop, and there we go. We have our 3D barrel that we've gone from start to finish. We've modeled it, we've UV'd it, we've textured it, and now we've presented it. And it's essentially the beginner's section of this entire process. So there we have it. That's our barrel from start to finish. The beginner's guide to the 3D barrel. Again, quick recap. We went from research to 3D modeling, and we saw that there's lots of different techniques for that, and then we UV mapped it, making sure we checked our UVs as we went with the checker pattern. We then made sure that our UVs were laid out as neatly as possible and uniform as possible to help with the texturing process. Then in the texturing phase we worked non-destructively, and we applied our knowledge of photo manipulation into effect. And then we took that into Marmoset and we presented it as well as we could do. So I hope that's given you a little bit of an insight into the process of making 3D assets. And hopefully you can continue from now on with maybe exploring some more advanced techniques. So maybe normal map baking, so creating a high poly version and baking it down to a low poly. Or maybe exploring some more advanced texturing techniques, maybe looking at PBR and moving on from there. So I hope that's helped you, and I'll see you next time.